We are, we are not deriving or inducing God from the fact of the infinite idea within our mind. That was Descartes. Instead, we are discovering, quote, an infinite realm of being, SoPheRE, of a new kind, as the sphere of a new kind of experience, transcendental experience, end quote. And the word that he's using for experience there is Erfahrung. What we find with the epoche, in other words, is being, not just a claim to being, but absolutely self-evident existences. And we do this as an experience. Transcendental subjectivity is a being and an experience of a new type. It is not a set of presupposed categories or pure intuitions. It is not mental. It is intuitive. This realm of experience is self-experience. It is the horizon of experiences of what lies within the transcendental ego, its structures, its webs of perceptions, imaginations, expectations, memories, etc. But how much of what we discover within the transcendental ego is apodictic, that is, has the impossibility of ever being doubted? How much of it is verifiable consistently and continually as belonging within this new sphere of being as that which we can have no conceivable doubt of? Husserl claims that, and this is on page 28, quote, the absolute evidence of the ego sum does after all extend, hineinreiche, necessarily into those manifolds of self-experience in which the ego's transcendental life and habitual properties are given, even if there are limits that define the range of these evidences. End quote. The being of the ego, in other words, is not a fact or a point. It is rather more like a diffusing circle of light. The being of the ego and its absolute evidence, which is part of that being, quote, extends, such that we see in its active self showing how it has, quote, a universal, apodictically experienceable structure, end quote, again on 28. We do not just experience the fact of the ego's being. We experience the manner of its givenness, that is, its, quote, temporal form, and its being, quote, apodictically pre-delineated. This is at the top of 29 in italics. We see the way in which the transcendental ego is toward its very concretion as this person which I am. My transcendental ego is thus mine because it shades itself off towards the concrete person I am becoming. I experience the temporality of the transcendental ego, its temporal form, as for this personal life. I experience the layer of transcendental experience as horizontally giving me the form of a personal life, as reaching toward it from within. I sense the extension of transcendental evidence into my concrete life. And then this is a quote from page 29. The ego is apodictically pre-delineated, right at the top of 29, for himself or herself as a concrete ego existing with an individual content. End quote. The task of the transcendental ego then is to extend its transcendental structures into concrete ones to allow us to experience transcendental life within concrete life and vice versa. As Husserl says, we are given our concrete subjectivity, that is, as Julia or Muhammad or Peter, as, quote, an experienceable object by the transcendental ego. And we are given it as an object that is a perfectible self-experience, quote, last two words of the section, without limit. There is always more to know, more to establish, more to verify about the concrete self. And this is so because it is given as an object to us by a transcendental ego that we are without being able to get behind. from the other side, in other words. The movement of the epoche is thus the reversal of the apparent priority of experience. And Julia was focusing on the notion of priority last time. We appear to move from the concrete to the transcendental. But what we discover when we move that way is that the transcendental has given the very possibility of the concrete. They are intertwined, and the science of consciousness is a movement back and forth between these layers of what I am. All right, so I'm going to go on to section 13 now. I see Evan's here. Welcome, Evan. So in section 13, the perfectibility of knowledge of my concrete ego is an extension of transcendental self-experience. The delimitation of what appears within transcendental self-experience as such is a, quote, great problem, page 29. We would have to look at the, quote, interwoven forms, verflechtenden Einzelformen, of transcendental experience, forms of temporality, modes of intuition, etc., and of the tissue of such forms, again, Verflechtung, with respect to the intertwining of transcendental and concrete life. We begin with the naive manner in which transcendental experience occurs. Naive manner is his words, page 29. The translation here is misleading. We begin with, quote, naive fungierenden Evidenz, or naively functioning evidence. We begin, in other words, as we live transcendental evidence within our lives prior to establishing the range of apodictic evidence. Thus, Husserl says, within our, quote, broadening of the Cartesian meditations, we will establish transcendental phenomenology in two stages. The first stage will be, quote, simple devotion to the evidence inherent in the harmonious flow of such an experience. So on page 29 still. We are not yet determining which evidences within that flow are apodictic and adequate. The second stage of phenomenology is the critical stage. What are the limits and range of the evidences we discover as taking their course within transcendental self-experience? We ask this question and thus find that we are within a new science, which does not study subjectivity as part of a world we take for granted as separate and existing. In transcendental phenomenology, in other words, we discover a subjectivity that does not depend on the world for its being or its evidence. Within our living out of transcendental subjectivity, we see that our ego, and this is over on page 30, quote, as thematic object exists whether or not the world exists. And so what are we doing? We thus, again on page 30, quote, parenthesize the distinction evinced within the ego between oneself and others. We do this because we need to restrict the evidences we find so that the second stage of phenomenology, the critical stage, can begin. To critique the realm of evidences, we need to pursue how the distinction between others and self can be evinced within the ego itself. But to do that, we need to know what I alone can experience. We need to witness this structure of evincing or appearing as a distinction directly. So we create methodologically, even here, this is well before the fourth meditation where he's going to do the move to the sphere of ownness, but we create methodologically the solipsistic part of our self-experiment in order to move toward that which we cannot see clearly at all, namely, the way in which other egos for me, quote, can become positable as existing and thus become equally legitimate themes, end quote. This is on page 30. So we need to see how the structure of evincing, especially with respect to others, comes up. Husserl emphasizes that the methodological decision to create a solipsistic beginning is one of creating, on page 30, quote, a subordinate stage. This means that Husserl is carrying us through the beginning of the science, having already achieved the insights that will later carry us into transcendental intersubjectivity. He has already carried out the critical experiments in Meditations 4 and 5, but we have to do it for ourselves in apodictic evidences. The step-by-step approach is necessary in order for us to see the method growing out of the complexity of the intertwined layers of self-experience. To experience oneself is to experience the other as within oneself, but we need to see how that other within me occurs as a meaningful event. So this is mostly, in a way, foreshadowing of what the fourth meditation is going to be about. And he's sort of showing you here in the consideration of evidence why the thought experiment of solipsism is going to be methodologically necessary. We are here at, quote, an essential deviation, this is page 31, from Descartes. Descartes did not see the evincing of the distinction of other and self within the self. Descartes also did not see that transcendental self-experience is infinite. Descartes took the fact of transcendental life and simply went on to deduce the existence of God from the idea of God. Descartes wanted to quickly move back to the assumption of the natural attitude, that is, that the world exists outside of consciousness, and therefore quickly rejoin the sciences. Husserl says, on the contrary, that transcendental phenomenology is the critical science that depends on its uniqueness and its isolation from all other sciences, insofar as it does not accept their main presupposition concerning the judgment of being. So now I'm going to move on to section 14, and then we'll stop and talk a little bit, and then Sally can go to 15 and 16. This is section 14. So we are shifting from the ego in its relation to the present act of thinking, ego cogito, to the cogitationes, that is, to the lived experiences that the ego dwells within. By doing this shift, we allow for the life of the ego to show through in greater temporal complexity. This is on page 31. We see, quote, the flowing conscious life in which we live. And flowing conscious life in German is strömenden Bewusstseinsleben. We can turn to our living, to our life as valuing, as perceiving, as remembering, etc. As this life, we are more than a mere point or a mere fact. We are living into and toward things in the world. We are intentional. We are bound up with the meaning of what appears as given. We are turning toward transcendental life, however, not as psychological and not as internal in the sense of an abstraction away from the world or from our bodies. Rather, we turn toward transcendental life as first defining what inside and outside mean. We are turning toward what Husserl says is the immanent. The transcendental epoche and reduction is not, on page 32, quote, abstractive restriction of anthropological research to purely psychic life. The abstraction of psychology, even pure psychology, still contains a presupposition of the world's existence. This presupposition is both within the subjectivity as conceived, that is, as a person belonging to the world, and within the very effort of abstraction itself. The abstraction is simply trying to use a technique to oppose that being of the world. Any opposition, if we just try to abstract from experience to psychological experience, any opposition, however, is an affirmation of the thing opposed. Conversely, Husserl's reduction in epoche is not an opposition. It's not a doubting. It's a suspension, and as such, it accepts the world as a phenomenon that claims a being of its own without accepting or participating in that claim. So the transcendental reduction is not an abstraction in the way that psychology usually is. If it were, it would find subjectivity as, and this is on page 32, quote, data belonging to the world. Instead, what we find within the epoche is that our experiences, our cogitationes, our life as intentional, is such that each thought, each perception, and this is on 32, quote, bear this relation, that is the relation to the world, within themselves, in sich selbst Besichung tragen. They bear the relationship to the world in themselves. Each lived experience, therefore, bears within itself the object. And bear, I take to mean tragen, is like being pregnant, right? And bear the child. We are conscious of things regardless of the suspension of their claim to being. The ego cogito is now with Husserl an ego cogito cogitatum, with the hyphens in between those three words, by which we mean that the object appears immanently within consciousness as bound up with the fact of transcendental life and with the act of transcendental consciousness. We are now within the realm of meaning as emanating from the being of the transcendental ego. And this is a quote from page 32. Each cogito, each conscious process, and the word process is horrible, it's Bewusstseinserlebnis, each lived experience of consciousness, means, meint, something or other, and bears in itself, in this manner peculiar to the ment, its particular cogitatum, or object. End quote. The origin of meaning, then, is within the way in which the ment calls for a particular kind of bearing within that each lived experience performs. Meaning is the embrace within the being of the transcendental subject of what is meant, what appears. It is the ment that establishes the extending of the transcendental subject into the concrete life of the concrete subject, that is, Jeremy or Marvin, by means of the object with which we are in contact. Intentionality is a pregnancy. It is a bearing within of what intends to be outside, what is always already on the way to the outside. And each pregnancy is different. Each new life sits differently within us and demands to be born differently. To have had one lived experience of bearing within, say of value or of perception, is not to have had them all. To perceive or read one book of Husserl, or one student, or one spouse or child, is not to perceive all of them in the same way. Givenness is infinite in its richness and calls forth powers of ours, bearing within, that emerge as new responses to new kinds of things. Okay, so that's 12 through 14. Why don't we take a few minutes and see if there's anything anyone wants to say or ask or whatever. Olga, go ahead.
Hi, Peter. I was thinking, comparing phenomenological reduction in ideas and then transcendental reduction in Cartesian meditations. So would it be correct to say that within the phenomenological reduction, the positings are dropped, means that we suspend assumptions about the particular being of the world or things, particular being of things. While in transcendental reduction, these assumptions, they remain operating, and thereby transcendental reduction gives us a more adequate, let's say, more realistic picture of the world with all the modes and assumptions of what this or that particular thing is in terms of its reality or unreality. So the transcendental reduction is, in a sense, more closely reflects the natural perception, richer in terms of relationships it discloses. Or are they equal? Can't hear you.
If I understand your question correctly, Olga, and tell me if I don't, please. You see a difference between the reduction discussed in ideas and the reduction discussed in Cartesian meditations.
I think so. I think that it's possible to work from the transcendental reduction into phenomenological reduction. But the other way around, it may be more difficult. And I think that transcendental reduction preserves the features of the natural consciousness maybe more adequately.
So I'm not alive to the distinction, I guess, between phenomenological and transcendental as you are differentiating them. I see what he's doing in ideas as the same as what he's doing here. So the epoche is the bracketing of the positionality of the natural attitude in terms of its assumption that being is simply there, simply on hand. And that means that all the positions that I take, positionality or positings, after the epoche are still there, but I am free to take them up as what the experience is colored by without actually participating in them.
Okay.
So then once the epoche is done, the reduction, which I think is both transcendental and phenomenological, allows us then to go after what is going to happen, I think, in Sally's and Jeremy's and Evan's sections, which is how this relationship of meaning or intending reveals a co-curricular system, as it were, of noesis and noema. So being able to account for the claim of the object or the world or the other person without actually saying whether the claim is absolute or not, that's where transcendental phenomenology takes us. And it takes us there by way of preserving, not doubting, preserving the positions or the positings without actually residing in them. So it's almost like they're there to be thematized and to be witnessed, but they're not there to be used, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Other thoughts on 12 through 14? Marvin.
Just to follow up on what you were saying, would it just now about the trying to recall the exact words, but like the propositions of existence not being accepted. Is that kind of the flavor of what you were saying? Like another way of saying it is it's experiencing without reification into objecthood.
Yes, it's almost that. It's not quite that in the sense that the object claims its objectness within our experience. And so we just try to stay true to the claim and to also notice how we participate in making that claim viable or understandable without then taking the object and declaring that it really
Right.
is as it claims to be. So it's really, so you were separating, I think, objectness and reification, which I think is mostly true. It's just that in phenomenology, the way in which the object appears is the only thing we're commenting on. So whatever else one could do, not even alive to that particular thing. It's just sort of how does it already reside within us, I guess.
Right. But uh, That sounds wonderful from my personal point of view of residing, but it seems to me that there's like an ongoing process of investigation. So at least for me, like this mode of being an object kind of indicates maybe I'm still in an object subjectivity spectrum. So
I like the notion of spectrum. I like the notion of connection. I think when we get to Evan's sections in 19 and 20, what we see is that your other thing that you said, that I mean, you've said lots of really interesting and helpful things, but the one about ongoing exploration or explanation, that is
right.
essential to phenomenology. That is, the object gets to claim us from within, from the beginning, because it does
Mm,
not fully offer itself to us. And therefore, it demands a very personal, ongoing taking up of what it presents itself to be. And so,
mm,
what I found reading at this time, and Evan, I'm not trying to steal your thunder, I am trying to, sort of allude to what's coming, is
mm,
that for Husserl, the transcendental ego and its whole project of reduction, for what Olga was saying, to try to connect back to that, cannot be anonymous. It has to be
mm.
personal. And so,
Right.
we have to be, as very unique um, instances of the transcendental ego, thoroughly committed to our perspectival, historical, individual ways of cashing out the meaning of these objects that are already within us. But there can
Mm,
only already be within by not fully being within, by having potential sides yet to be seen or potential references yet to be crossed, right? So there's always the Rubicon
right.
yet to come kind of thing. But so anyway, that's what I just wanted to highlight. So largely, you're absolutely right on in both things that you said. It's just that I just want to emphasize how important it is, based on what you said, to remember that this is not an abstract logical process simply. This is a
Right.
personal, non-anonymous process.
Right. No, that's very helpful. Thank you. Uh, and I had kind of two questions or comments. One is in this section, it's contrasted with a psychology, and he says even a pure psychology, that this is different. And I'm wondering if it's maybe somewhat of a historical difference of the psychology at the time of this writing, which is quite a long time ago, that even pure psychology in his terms at that time still had an assumption of the reality of a so-called external world. And that's really what he's highlighting here. And I think maybe nowadays in psychology, there's more openness, perhaps due to the very influence of phenomenology on psychology, that both points of view are entertained.
I think that's right. I think his fight today would be to distinguish what he's doing from behaviorism. That is, that
Right,
psychology now seems much more committed to rats running around mazes and, proving something about how we process the world. And so he would, I think, say, um, you know, if you really think that psychological operations are reducible to brain events, then you haven't understood what it is that I'm trying to talk about. I think that's where he would have to go. Whereas before, well, you're right. Historically, before it was the other side. Now he's got to,
right,
yeah.
right. Oh, okay. And another comment or question is this meaning arising out of the disclosure of the transcendental uh, experience. Is this the same kind of meaning that existentialists talk about, or are the existentialists, in some sense, contesting this point of meaning coming from it? Because I thought a theme in existentialism is that the sensory experience, the unfolding of experience, is not sufficient for meaning.
So that's a great question as well. I want to make sure I get to Mohammed after this and anyone else. But what's really helpful, Marvin, is that in the way you've asked that question, it allows me to be able to say that I think, and this is just something I've come to literally as you asked the question, I think the difference is that for existentialists, as I read them, like Camus and Sartre, meaning is something that I literally make up as I bring myself to other people or to the world or whatever. Like meaning is a choice, as it were, or meaning is this sort of angst inducing or angst addressing thing that I
Right.
do.
The
Um,
angst comes from the inherent lack of meaning
that's right. It comes from the
and the
meaninglessness.
depression and
Yeah,
I can't
yeah,
don't know the meaning of my life.
that's right.
Woe
Whereas
is me.
that's right. Whereas Husserl is saying that meaning arises within the intertwining of subject and object. So especially
Right.
in Jeremy's sections, I think the point of phenomenology is to say meaning originates in the very call and response of subject and object. It is not just my doing, and it is not just the object. You couldn't pull those two apart. And so existentialism sins with respect to the subject. Realism sins with respect to the object. Phenomenology doesn't sin. Right?
It's the middle way, the
I think
perfect
that's,
middle way.
yeah, that's right. It is the middle way. It's the middle voice, as Plato might say. Yes. All right, Mohammed, what can we do?
Thank you.
Uh, so I had a question kind of going back to what Olga mentioned. So is it, and I'm trying to say it sort of maybe in a simple layman term, uh, the two reduction, is it the case that one reduction is more toward knowing the object and the other reduction is more trying to know the ego or the subject? Is that sort of the directionality of those two reduction might be a little bit different, or the intention of it might be a little bit different?
Well, I would have to sit down with you and Olga, and together we could look at the passages where there might be a suggestion that those two are different. My sense of the reduction in Husserl is both that it's singular, that is, it allows us to see both the subject and the object and their interconnection as we bracket the metaphysical game that many other people play. So it's both singular, it's that which gives us the capacity to turn or as he says, zigzag back and forth between the subject or the noetic acts and the object or the noematic layers of sense. However, what you and Olga are both pointing toward, and Merleau-Ponty notes this pretty clearly in the Phenomenology of Perception, that the reduction is never finished and it is multiple. Uh, One way in which we can see the reduction is multiple is when in the fourth and fifth meditation, when he does the reduction to the sphere of ownness. So when he brackets all meanings that connect with other people and we're left within the sphere of ownness, that is one of the other reductions that we do. And we do that in order to focus our searchlight, as it were, on the coming to be of the sense of other person within our consciousness. So it isn't wrong to think that there are multiple reductions, but insofar as I read this book and insofar as I remember the ideas, there isn't one reduction for the subject and one reduction for the object, precisely because they cannot be disentangled. But
And just, sorry, go on.
Go ahead, sorry.
So, and then the sort of the follow-up to that, the way you were sort of describing this transcendental subjectivity, and so it's sort of a repetitive process, or sort of infinite process. So is it then kind of fair to say, as you exercise this reduction, you essentially expand the plane of knowing the self or the ego? And every time you exercise this, you get to know yourself. And so through that means, through that process, you essentially get to chart this ego.
That's beautiful. I think absolutely. I didn't say it as well, and I couldn't say it as well. Like that's just true. right? That's why this new field of phenomenology, he calls it an infinite field, an infinite task. What we're revealing is how we are always already having lived experiences that work to make sense of the object that already shows itself to us without our having remembered or experienced those experiences that go into forming it. So in the ideas, he'll talk about adumbrations, where the color of the desk that you're sitting at is really not a uniform brown or black or whatever, but has little flecks or little differences of light and shading. And those differences are not ones that, you see the single color of the desk despite them. No, they contribute in their internal differences toward the one color that you've already seen. And so just like he's saying, the adumbrations have to be part of this perceptual seeing, even though I don't remember or cannot attend to them as my eyes go across the surface. So too, all these transcendental acts and objects of my experience that go to building up the sort of whole perception of this thing, this webinar, this book, this whatever, like those are what we have to pay attention to, and we can pay attention to now that the transcendental reduction has been something we've performed. And so, yes, it means that we now have an infinite field of things to discover, which again have always already started, because where we start in phenomenology is with the object as already calling to us, it's almost like the baby is already there. It's like, oh my God, I'm pregnant. What do I do? Like I didn't know. Here it is. That I think is why it's infinite, because the object has us under its spell and has made us responsible for it in ways that we aren't aware of. So we're coming home, as it were, to our responsibility for what we bear within us.
And I think so that there is a parallel in the way sort of, I think, in Sufi literature when they talk about this. And so I think it's definitely that it exists in there as well too. So that's where I'm sort of coming from. So that's kind of formulating from a Sufi perspective.
So that sounds like a book or a paper that you should write.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Yeah. Evan.
Morning, and more of a clarification question, kind of centered around 33, particularly what you said about those methodological movements between abstraction and sort of, well, to the quote here about the house perception near the end. The house perception means a house more precisely as this individual house, and means it in the fashion particular to perception. A house memory means a house in the fashion particular to memory. A fantasy in the fashion particular to fantasy. I guess my question, hearing you speak about the particularity there, is it seems like even in our experience of the house, there still seems to be some abstraction there that I want to be clear is not what's happening, because even in identifying it as a house, we do have to return back either to the memory or to a kind of fantasy to say what a house is. If we're in the pure experience of the moment, how do we get that category of house? That's sort of my clarification question there.
So that's a great clarification question. What you see in what you just read, I was following along as you read on page 33 before Sally's section 15, is you see him listing the modes of intuition. The modes of intuition are thinking, imagining, valuing, remembering, and they are all distinct. And so that's part of why for Muhammad, subjectivity will be infinite, because it does not have simply one way of encountering or intertwining with the object. It has many, many ways. And we're not even sure that we know all of them, right? Or could attend to all of them. But the house then is given as perceived, as valued, as imagined, as remembered in very different modes also. And those are called modes of givenness. So the modes of intuition map on to the modes of givenness. So the house appears differently within different modes of intuition. That is, it gives itself to different actions differently. So then, like to some extent, we're just left with that. Like there are just multiple ways of being a house, or multiple ways of appearing as a house. And yet there is this sense, as I think you were talking about, of the house as the object across the different modes of intuition and modes of givenness. But whatever that identity is, the sameness, does not come about despite the differences in modes of intuition or modes of givenness. It comes about through them. So it arises as a whole unitary self-same thing, precisely because of the differences in the modes of intuition and givenness, much like the whole color of the table in front of you arises by means of the differences of the adumbrations of that same color. So it is not something that we pull out and is up here and not over there, right? It is, again, a unity in essence that arises through the variations in modes of givenness and modes of intuition.
If I'm correct, so that seems to be related to the suspension. Is that right? That we're not getting rid of the house in that way. We're just not focused on that, because that's not the experience that we're really focusing. That's really
right.
helpful.
And that's why it's not Plato, or at least a certain reading of Plato. That's why it's not that the ideal is up there, and what you have to learn is to get rid of all the different modes of intuition, modes of givenness, and just see this intuition directly. You still see the intuition directly, but you see it not by getting rid of the modes, but by moving through them. Olga. You're muted, Olga.
Do we have time to spend maybe a minute on ontological speculations?
I think if we are going to get to all three of our participants today, I might ask if we could put that at the end. Is that okay? I've been long-winded. It's really my fault. But, okay, Sally, how about you? And everybody can click on your summary in the chat, and I think Jeremy put his as well. So, Sally, go ahead.
Hey, thanks. So yes, my outline here, where my presentation begins, is about 3/4 of the way down on the page 1, beginning in green, 215. But I wanted to open up by saying, you know, what I found reading through all of the second meditation here is that it really is bringing to light this process orientation, and to kind of dovetail on to what was said just a few minutes ago, on page 32, Husserl distinguishes between psychology, which I found really interesting, by saying it's the objective study of subjectivity, versus philosophy, which is a way of thinking, a process, and a method of unpacking and understanding. So I found that really powerful. Okay, so beginning with number 15, intentionality is the conscious process each cogito has as they are observing something. Husserl says it is the fundamental aspect of consciousness, what consciousness does. But especially on page 30, well, I'm back to page 31 here. Intentionality has to do with the relationship between observing and conscious processing of the contents. Intentionality is the fundamental aspect of consciousness. Here, Husserl distinguishes between natural and transcendental reflection, what consciousness does. Okay, so A, natural reflection is perception, straightforward perception, directedness. I think about my psychic process, such as I see a house, where just what Evan was mentioning. It objectifies, transcends into a new type of reflection, however. Here, the naive, interested ego moves to be a disinterested ego. And this is something that I will inject here, is that maybe you don't remember, but the first thing I said at the beginning of our meetings here is I'm struggling with, I want to get the bull by the horns and understand how Husserl, the path he gets to objectivity, apodicticity. Okay, so I think this move to be the transcendental reflection is the step to objectivity or apodicticity. Transcendental reflection is thinking about the flowing, making perception accessible to us so that we can describe. It's moving beyond that which has been observed. We explicate what we have found in A. I have had a perception whose contents entail a house. This implements the epoche. I reflect upon the subjective observation. The only interest for the, now we're moving to page 35. The only interest for this phenomenological ego is to reflect, to see and to describe adequately what he sees, purely as seen, and what is seen and seen in such and such a manner. Thus, all occurrences of life turned towards the world become accessible to description. This is unprejudiced. This is objective, universal, the universal objective apodictic stage. I didn't include my comments here, but I mean, my question would be here, how does saying this make it so? Is it just purely the fact that, which I think I'll get to shortly, is that this infinite possibilities out there, that's what makes it objective? That's my question. Anyway, page 36 to continue. Here we move to a discussion of the process of the transcendental experience, aka consciousness perception, noesis versus noema. And I tried to separate them, and I see in the produced document it didn't really quite follow. But the noesis is describing the qualities of the content, not so much the subject. And again, Husserl distinguishes between a subject and object in the classic sense. They're not oppositional in Husserl's analysis, but noesis being the subject and noema being the object, but again, not in the classical sense. My first asterisk here on page 2 is, but in the phenomenological method, there is a co-awareness and interconnectedness between the subject and the object. And I think we've already kind of touched on that too. We don't see a house as separated from us. Once we see a house in a way, we have a relationship with it. So back to the noesis, noema distinction. Noesis is pure consciousness, whereas noema is not so much the object, but the meaning. In the noetic description of the qualities of intentional acts, such as perception, retention, imagined, desiring, imagining aspects of their daily clarity and or distinctiveness. But in the noema, this is the description of the object as it is perceived. Its characteristic attributes and corresponding modalities stand out when reflecting on them. And here again are all kinds of possibilities. It is possible, probable, certain, past, present, and future. All these things are taken into consideration. And this then moves to the transcendental phenomenology, is thus the objective because there are infinite possibilities of meaning. And my double asterisk here, and this is again where I think we're getting to the objective stage to reiterate, and this is the objective part, the shift from the subjective to apodictic, noesis to noema. Transcendental phenomenology is the universal description by a subjective actor of the objects observed. Pages 36 to 37, there is always a co-awareness of partiality, subjectivity, the particularity, and the wholeness, the universal. The universe remains as existing background to our whole life. That's how I closed out number 15, and then moving on to 16 on page 3. There is an infinite multiplicity of particular, concrete, subjective observations and processes. And again, this is the objective part because there's just this infinite number of subjective interpretations. That's what objectivity is. There is a natural open-ended universality between the ego and his unitary intentional life. I, the mediating phenomenologist, set myself the all-embracing task of uncovering myself in my full concreteness, that is, with all the intentional correlates that are included therein. Page 38. This is the quote, manifestly, this is, quote, manifestly a transcendental descriptive egology. And that was defined earlier in the second meditation. derived quite exclusively from internal experience, from pure inner psychology. So my last point is, please correct me if I'm wrong here. H then goes on to explain why the prevailing tradition of sensualism is wrong, because it places conscious life outside of oneself, externally, or to put it another way, psychological. So
Good. Very, very nice. Unfortunately, I tried to open your summary as you were speaking, and it doesn't let me.
oh
So
no.
I'm not, and I think Evan got here too late, and maybe Christian got here too late. So I'm wondering if you could put that back in the
Sure,
chat again.
absolutely.
Anyone have any thoughts for Sally or questions?
Just as a point of order request, I kind of want to sit on 19 and 20, maybe in chat with Olga. We meet on Mondays to sort of talk. Maybe we could parse out, because there's a lot of material there. And I'd rather hold off, if possible, on 19 and 20, if that's just something to lift up.
Marvin.
This is kind of related to the example of the house, that like I experience kind of the sense of say shape and whiteness, and there's like a memory of this perhaps thing before, and then from all of these things the meaning of a house comes up. But I'm wondering, like, is there how would the distinction play out between the two cases of being right about it being a house and me being mistaken that it's a house? Like maybe it's more in the distance and actually it's a barn, or I'm just mistaken where I am, and that sense of being here before is misleading, maybe some of the features of the surroundings or so on. So I don't know, I'm kind of struggling with this sense of meaning and how it lines up to being the case or not. I guess veracity might be one way of framing that. I don't know.
Sally, you want to talk about that?
I don't know how I would answer that, but what I agree with you. I'm struggling with is that, like, okay, you see something that you identify as a house, but then you move to transcendental reflection, and then that's where this realm of infinite possibilities in terms of what it could be enter into it. That's what I'm thinking. And again,
Yeah, there's a realm of infinite possibilities, but I might pick one, but it might not be the case. Or maybe it's we pick something, but it's the best we do, and it's up to further disclosure to decide if it's that tentative picking is the right picking. Or I don't know how this works.
Olga, you look like you'd like to say something.
Well, I think it would be better if you say something, but I think that, well, let's see, the way I feel it, that in this text, Husserl outlines, well, at least what we are covering, most general contours of this transcendental eidetics. So he sort of gives the scheme of things in very broad strokes. And then, but he talks about temporality, and that's one aspect. The perception and the judgment will be constantly verified against the previous acts. Then it will be also intersubjectively in the horizon which is co-created by the self and others. And then the categoriality of which I think was Sally's question, will be also set up to a degree a prioristically, actually fully, from all the previous experiences. So there is this act of perception, but there is a whole battery of tools around it which delimit the arbitrariness in assigning categorical judgment as to what it is. However, I think that both Sally's doubt and Marvin's question, they also have a very solid ontological kind of seed of question, the other question, as to why do we have this freedom of blanking out the world or the existence of the world? Like, how did we end up in the situation where on one hand we are very firmly defined by our own presence to ourselves and or the capacity of self-reflection, but then and this ongoing thematization of the self. But then on the other hand, we can position the world solipsistically, or at least we think that we can position it. I mean, the world will eventually break our solipsism. But we do have this possibility to say nothing is real, and I'm the only one remaining, and try to live happily ever after with it. So there must be something in the scheme of things which warrants or justifies this situation. So that's what I would say.
Evan.
I'm very interested with the questions that were going there about how the notion of interested versus disinterested sort of plays with this. On a pure side of disinterested sounds a little Kantian to me, and maybe I'm using the terms equivocally there then, but looking at 35, that sort of first full paragraph there, it seems to me to take, is it Marvin's question there about the house that becomes a barn. If the ego, as naturally immersed in the world, experiencing and otherwise is called interested in the world, then the phenomenologically altered and as so altered continually maintained attitudes consist in splitting the ego, the phenomenological ego establishing themselves as disinterested onlooker above the naively interested ego. I sort of thought about how you talked about the house barn as being in the phenomenological sort of investigation. That's kind of all right if the house turns out to be a barn, because you learn within the realm of potential horizons that exist within barn and house, there may be multiple experiences. And really that we're investigating the fact that barns can look like houses. And that's a structure of consciousness that's kind of interesting to experience. I don't know if I'm helpful in saying that or if that's losing the plot, but I think disinterestedness might be part, particularly in this section that Husserl is talking about. Is that on the money, or does that sound wrong?
Disinterest does sound related to the idea of things are always provisional. There's some kind of distance there. It's not like a naive saying, oh, this is what it is. So there's openness to change.
Julia.
Yeah, similar to this idea, on page 35, right below where that 74 mark is, or right around there, where he's talking about pure of all accompanying and expectant meanings on the observer's part, that we need to purify our perception of what we expect will come next. Even before I read that part, I was thinking as I was reading that if I didn't have some loose idea of what is going to come next as I'm reading, for example, that I would be unable to understand the current sentence that I'm reading if I don't think about what reasonably comes next. I mean, like the way he puts it, pure of all. I guess, like we're saying, the disinterestedness leaves it as provisional, or you're open to change. Like if I'm reading and I completely anticipate the next sentence and think, oh, he has to say this next, then I wouldn't be a good reader either. And so, how can it be that it's pure of all?
So that's, I think, a question that just means pure of assumptions about ontology, to go back to Olga's point, pure of the expectation or the accompanying belief that things are outside of consciousness as they present themselves in consciousness. So if you look at the previous paragraph, the last sentence there on 35, the ego's sole remaining interest being to see and to describe adequately what they see, purely as seen, as what is seen in such and such a manner. So, in other words, he's broadening from seeing into the thing you read, Julia, all occurrences of life turn toward the world. That doesn't mean we can't pay attention to how your expectations structure the way in which you read a book, right? That you have to have expectations there. So you're right. If we tried to separate solely the purest point of present experience, we couldn't say anything. So that's true. There would not be any experience and there would be nothing to say. So you're absolutely correct about that. But I think what he means is that we withhold our capacity to make um, to inhabit those positions with respect to being that the object is claiming within consciousness. Olga.
I just want to offer a footnote because I think in ideas Husserl returns in several ways to the difficulty of untangling the pure presentation, the pure givenness from the judgment the ego bestows. And he actually, I forgot the page, but he struggles with it and says that it's next to impossible, maybe even, to accomplish this purification. And I don't know if he returns to this question in his later work, but there is really no possibility, no method that would strip the pure intuition from interpretation. So that's what it seems to me, I think.
No, intuition has to be already interpretation, right? So, and the intuition must reflect the description that we want to give it. So that's true. This is a question to everybody. So I have written out stuff on every section that we will have. And I am certainly willing to read what I have on 15 and 16 if that would be helpful. I don't have to. Like, I think, Sally, you raised the most important issues in 15 and 16, and we can go on without them. I can speak a little bit about some of the issues. It's up to you all. Like, what do you want me to do? Would it be better for you if we went to Jeremy and we did 17 and 18? Or would it be helpful if I were to say some things about reflection and the ego cogito with respect to these two sections? Like, what do you want me to do, I guess? Christos.
I'm not too sure is the answer. And I was just thinking that I think echoing Evan's comment, I think that there is a lot there, and I wondered whether the pace kind of is allowing me perhaps enough time to think about it. I mean, I've got a few comments on this existing section. I don't know if it would be possible to bring them out. I'd be happy to look at the points that you raise. But yeah.
Other thoughts about what you'd like?
I'm happy to listen to a review, because again, I just think that this is like fundamental. This is making the crucial leap, this two-step process. I think it would be helpful, so to reinforce.
Okay.
I would agree. Usually when I paint a house, I put on a few rounds of primer. It's okay to have a couple of passes on the thing.
Yeah.
Okay. Julia, what about you?
Yeah, I want to hear more about the sensualism and the external and internal sense.
All right, well, shall I just start? And then if you've had enough of me and you want to go to Jeremy, you can do that. I think, Sally, that you did a great job of calling our attention to what this discussion of reflection it means and why it might be problematic. I think Marvin's question about the reflection as we proceed in an experience of something that gives itself to us first as a house and then as a barn, or perhaps if we were to go to the Wild West and we see a house and then we look behind it and it's simply one side, right? Like that takes you back, and then, oh, it's just a set for something or whatever. That's not the kind of reflection that I think Husserl is talking about in this section. We, of course, do reflect within an ongoing procedure of experience like the one that Marvin suggests. But what's really interesting about that process is that as we encounter the set of the movie, or that it is actually a barn, it reflects backwards into our past experience, such that we can no longer remember what it was to experience this simply as a house. It now is experienced as that which we used to experience as a house, but now know to be a barn. So we are never within that original perception anymore, even in memory, as the same. So I think there's lots of interesting things that Husserl himself points up about that. But I think Olga's point about this being methodological, this is a new way of thinking about reflection, and it's kind of a universal statement or description by Husserl of what it means to enter into, as Evan said, this disinterested, actually the German is uninterested, onlooker, right? This whatever we're doing in phenomenology is a kind of thing that we need to clarify, precisely because it isn't just the way in which we mistake the barn for the house. So I'll say some things, and then please stop me if you've had enough of me, all right? Because Sally did an excellent job. Yes, Olga.
Yeah, I have an urgent comment. I remembered where it really distinction fails for Husserl, or definitions between illusion and reality. If you have any insight on that, you can talk about it. Because it always, his position, Husserl's positions, always seemed objectionable to me, but I'm not sure how to dismantle it systematically.
Well, I think Sally's point about phenomenology as process-oriented, the very thing you began with, Sally, is really important. And I think Marvin's point about it being ongoing, it being a process or a synthesis of fulfillment, Like we don't just know, we know as a way to further uncovering, and therefore we're always able to grasp or posit the object as what it is on the basis of being able to get nearer, being able to move around it, right? So it's always what is meant within a process of fulfilling the empty intentions that go along with the fulfilled ones. So it's this ongoing process of fulfilling the intentions that are there, but we have not yet lived in them. We have not yet lived into the evidence of them. And so illusion and reality are simply the ongoing exchange of unfulfilled to fulfilled in ways that then cancel out or mark with an X things that are still within the realm of memory as part of this experience of the object, but now no longer part of it. Okay.
I think one thing Husserl also says there is that, for example, when you see a mirage and realize it's a mirage, that makes sense to us, but that only makes sense within an overall framework of meaning and truth. So that we are in touch with meaning and truth is indubitable.
Yes.
And illusion only makes sense within that. I think that's kind of Husserl's answer to the problem of error and illusion.
That's great, Jeremy. I think that's right. Okay, so let's look at section 15. Husserl begins to describe the difference between immediate acts of subjectivity, perceiving, remembering, etc., and reflection. It's important to do a phenomenology of reflection because the experience of reflection is something like what Evan said, a self-splitting. This is a really important word, and it's not one that I completely understand, but it's the splitting part seems to be important. Like in order to reflect, I then split myself from myself. It begins to sound like Severance. I don't know if you all watch that Apple TV thing, but I think it's really cool. Anyway, it's like that. So in reflection of any kind, there are, this is page 33, quote, grasping acts belonging to a new level. These grasping acts allow the straightforward acts in which we focus on the object and not our act to, quote, become accessible to us. The German there is uns eben die Akte geradhin erst erschließen. Literally, we allow our straightforward acts of perception to open up. That's really what erschließen means, open up for us. These straightforward acts, perceiving the house and then perceiving the barn, yield themselves to us within reflection, a level in which we become open to what we are doing. We can direct ourselves, Husserl says, to our being directed to the house. We do not simply grasp things. In reflection, we grasp relations, even our own. We grasp intentionality by a move to a new level. It is not an assumption that we are directed to things. We witness it. Though Husserl does not say this, it would appear that our being able to, this is on page 34, quote, stand on the footing of the world already given. The German is vorgegebenen Welt, the pre-given world. So I'm saying, Peter is saying, I think Husserl does not quite say this, but it's because we have a pre-given world that reflection is motivated. Yes, the epoche allows us to bracket the presupposed or supposed existence of the world, but the very fact of pre-givenness, that the world is already claiming its meaning, does not disappear. Reflection is what happens when we are always already engaged with pre-givenness, already directed without meaning to be directed, already meaning. Reflection is simply the way to come home to what we are already engaged with. Therefore, givenness is what allows reflection. It is what demands reflection. And thus we can recognize that we are already responding to givenness and that we bring to it a set of presuppositions that it does not necessarily call for. The epoche is thus an act of responsibility if we are willing to remain within a certain kind of reflection. This is what we are called to do in response to the given. With respect to the danger of presuppositions, which we bracket, and Julia talked about these, and witness with the epoche, there is another danger, namely the way in which any reflection alters the immediate act of perceiving or remembering. Reflection is not innocent. Rather, this is on page 34, reflection, quote, alters the original lived experience. He says subjective process, the translator, but it's original lived experience. We make the original perceiving act other than what it is, veranderen. We change it. We make it other. Reflection makes, quote, an object out of what was previously a subjective process, a lived experience, Erlebnis. Reflection is not repetition. It does not, quote, repeat the original process, das ursprüngliche Erlebnis wiederholen, but makes a transition, Übergang, going over, to a, quote, new intentional process that is always already relating back to the earlier experience. Reflection, then, is another experience. It is an Erfahrung, a grasping or a confrontation or an encounter with or of an Erlebnis, a lived experience. Reflection encounters the lived experience and sees its moments, its act, and object. And this is on page 34 over to 35. And so I've said that it's an Erfahrung of an Erlebnis. So there's two words for experience in German. The Erfahrung is the encounter, Erlebnis is the lived through character. Reflecting, experiencing, reflektierende Erfahrung, is precisely an experiencing of the house perception with all its moments, the moments of the perceiving as the flowing subjective experience, strömenden Erlebens, and the moments of the perceived house. Reflection then changes the lived experience into an object that it can encounter and explicate, because reflection takes lived experience into an encounter. Husserl now calls the movement of reflection within phenomenology specifically a splitting of the ego. That's on page 35, sort of up towards the top. That which I am is different in terms of straightforward perception and reflection. I am not the same I. The straightforward ego is, quote, interested in the world, 35, and, quote, the phenomenological ego establishes itself as disinterested onlooker. And Husserl says a disinterested onlooker from above, like seeing down. If this sounds like, and Evan mentioned Kant's description of what happens in the experience of beauty, where you have a disinterested pleasure in what appears, perhaps it should. In the third critique, Kant argues there are three kinds of liking, for the gratifying, the good, and the beautiful. Only within the experience of beauty do we find a kind of disinterest in the existence of the object that motivates the reflective judgment. It is this disinterested pleasure that Kant says allows us to remain within the free play of imagination and understanding. And remember, for Kant, there's no real objective relation. Beauty is what's happening in the imagination and understanding. It's not really what's happening as the quality of the object. Ironically, it is the removal of the object's existence as an interest that forces the object for Kant into a strange liminal showing of itself. For beauty still is, as if for Kant, a property of the object. But here, Husserl would emphasize that the disinterest of the onlooker allows for meaning to be described as the object. And so when I responded to Julia, to you, it was the sentence before where you were, the ego's sole remaining interest being to see and describe adequately what they see. So Husserl has surpassed Kant, preventing someone like Derrida from saying that the reframing of a relationship to objectivity displays an internal fault that collapses the system. That's what Derrida actually says, right? The disinterest, then, this splitting of the eye, means that we are now able to see how we can try to pursue, quote, the Cartesian idea of philosophy as the idea of the all-embracing science. With the phenomenological onlooker, this is disinterested split eye, right, we can describe the events or the eventfulness of the way in which we are, quote, turned toward the world by means of positions we take in terms of being. It is this possibility of reflecting and dwelling within the same perceptive act in relation to the perceptive object while still operating within another mode or on another level of our subjectivity that allows us to pursue, quote, a universe of absolute freedom from prejudice. So while the splitting seems kind of painful, harmful, not quite a doubling, but yet not the same, this splitting allows for, perhaps, Jeremy, I'm not sure, I'm going to test this out with you, the very possibility of being within the realm of truth, right? It's a universe of absolute freedom from prejudice. So without reflection, would we be participating in the realm of truth is what I think the question might be. Reflection in phenomenology, therefore, quote, inhibits universal prejudice. It's a kind of inoculation. The virus still inhabits us, but it is under watch and defanged. And thus does consciousness and phenomenology show its health. It demonstrates its, and this is page 36, quote, striving, anstrebt, for a universal description. This universal description can only occur if we limit ourselves, quote, to the pure data, it's actually pure givenness, die puren Gegebenheiten of transcendental reflection. This is page 36. So whatever is given to reflection purely is what we're going to be able to describe accurately. To restrict ourselves to pure givenness is thus to inoculate ourselves from interest and to let what appears be such that a disinterested onlooker would recognize it. There are now, quote, and this is where Sally was going with the noesis noema, I think, on page 36, two correlative sides of description, the subject acting and the object acted upon. There are noematic and noetic lines of description that must each gather their proper attention. While the translation says that, quote, the determinations, Bestimmungen, are attributed to the intentional object, that's kind of wrong. What Husserl actually says is that the determinations that the disinterested onlooker fixes, the way that they describe what they see, are those that are meant, zugemeinten. We intend what is given. We read off of the thing what its determinations are because it solicits us to mean and choose those terms. We do not simply attribute. That centers itself too much in the agency of the ego. We mean and we express what it shows. The world, Husserl says, is not lost to us when we perform the epoche. It is retained as a new experience of meaningful interaction. Meaning is a relationship between consciousness and object. It is not, meaning is not, an independent process that we bump up against and translate. Meaning is translation according to an already existing correlation. And you don't get noesis noema without this particular kind of reflection. You don't see this. You can't move from assuming that the object is separate from you and exists on its own to the interplay and the correlation without the specific kind of reflection that Husserl is talking about. I think that's, in other words, that's what he thinks that he's doing. We mean not just a particular thing, but, quote, a unitary universe, this is page 37, still in the quote, which even when we are directed to and grasping the particular goes on appearing unitarily. So it's always the thing within the context of the entirety, right? The way in which this power of the whole world or the whole universe appears within the appearing of the particular is that it is not only the thing's background. It is not just the stage on which the thing appears. It is the very stage that we belong to as well. The universe is the totality in which we find ourselves, It is, page 37, quote, the existing background of our whole natural life. And the only way the universe can be both the backdrop of the thing and of our life is that the very sense of the whole, of the world, is immanent to transcendental subjectivity. So once you reflect on it, Husserl makes sense of this paradox in the crisis. I think he's been carrying it this entire time. I live in the world. I am experiencing that I live in the world as a part of the world. I experience all of my connectedness in my life to my family, my friends, the people in the webinar, my students, the sun outside, whatever it is. And yet, as part of that world, I am conscious of that whole world. Right? So all of the world, in some sense, all the universe is I'm pointing to my head, but what I mean is it's within my intentionality. So how is it possible that I, a part of the world, can be conscious of the entire world? That's the paradox. And that's what he's expressing here. This is where the reflection of phenomenology is going in section 15 and elsewhere. Like, it's not, reflection is about getting to the point of seeing the thorough interconnection between subject and object as existing prior to the distinction between subject and object. So what Sally called object in the classical sense, that is the thing that confronts us as simply not being us, that classical sense is dependent on the phenomenological sense in which the correlation is first, the unity is first, and the distinction is second. So the position of the disinterested onlooker is the position of the whole of transcendental subjectivity, which is not simply the ego, but the ego in relation to the world, the ego in relation to the object, the ego in relation to its own lived experiences. The world is not a foreign concept. It is my very living as such. Husserl says this when he emphasizes that on the noetic side, there is, quote, the openly endless life of pure consciousness. So Muhammad said it's this infinite thing. And on the noetic side, quote, the ment world. So I and world are quite similar, right? I have this openly endless, infinite transcendental subjectivity. The world is this openly endless, absolutely ongoing set of relations. Why does that matter? Because that's why they're all interconnected, right? So that's how you start. You start by reflecting on the way in which I have an internal structure that is very similar to the structure of world. I can go on from thing to thing to thing in my own life. I can go on from thing to thing to thing on the horizon. We're made for each other. So the disinterested onlooker sees all of this. As Husserl says explicitly, quote, not only in respect of particulars, but also universally, the phenomenological ego can see itself. Again, however, what the I is that the phenomenological ego sees is much broader than the I that I am within my concrete particular living. The world appears as the index of my, quote, interconnected cogitationes. The world is my has been, could be, should be, is, and will be. Like, I'm never going to get there. I'm never going to adequately claim that I know the world or am the world. It doesn't matter how much I eat, and I eat more and more as I get older, because I'm really trying to grow here, really trying to be the world. At least by eating the world, I can be the world. It's going to fail, right? Concretely, but it won't fail transcendentally. The object as given by means of the world is also, quote, the intentional correlate of modes of consciousness. So in my view, nothing from the ideas has changed here. This is simply a representation of the material in the 3 volumes of ideas. So the only thing I'll say before seeing what Jeremy would like to do with his sections is to say, I would spend more time on reflection if I were you, because it is precisely what other people after Husserl do. So like Merleau-Ponty has entire books just on reflection in phenomenology. And it's really important to clarify how it is that we can split off from ourselves and what this self-splitting and internal self-relation means. I will also say one last thing, which is that if we did not split off in reflection, it is not clear to me that we would be able to make sense of how the other person is already implicated in me. It's not adequate. The alterity that I exist to myself in terms of the reflecting phenomenological ego and the straightforwardly perceiving ego. These are both within the transcendental epoche, right? It's not clear that the alterity of one to the other, above and below, is sufficient to recognize the other's radical alterity to me. But I think reflection is the way in which I exist a relationship that can make sense of this supercharged alterity that is sort of having its way within me by means of my emotions of love or hatred or whatever. So, Jeremy, before I get to Muhammad, would you like to go now, or would you like to start next time? I can't. You're muted still.
I think I could go for 15 minutes, but then there's no time for discussion. And what I see in those sections is something that really does bring a lot of things together. So maybe that might not be a bad idea to start with next time, because it's kind of a bridge. And like in section 18, I actually picked a paragraph and translated it myself that I think is really crucial, where he talks about what does it mean to be in consciousness. And I think that's really significant. And I think that'd be a good thing to start with.
Okay, well,
So maybe why don't we do it that way?
That sounds great. And I apologize for being so slow and taking more time than I perhaps should have. But I think we'll start with you, Evan. You have a reprieve for 2 weeks, so you can do 19 and 20, and then I will finish. None of you should feel like if you can't do it, that the group will not have anything. I'm going to continue. I'm using this as an occasion to write a commentary on the Cartesian meditation. So I will continue to do that. I just want you to feel empowered to do what you can do, because I think, you're very bright people and you do really well. Like Sally raised a whole lot of things that we can talk about for many, many days here. And she did a good job, as did Julia, did a really good job. So I just want you to feel comfortable and to say to me, if I'm doing too much, you pull it back. And if I need to do more, I will do more. Muhammad.
So just kind of the example that you gave, I think was a very nice example, eating the word. And I think this whole notion of onlookers, it seems like, if I'm not mistaken, the whole notion of onlooker fundamentally is prejudice, because you can just sort of reduce it to this example of eating the word, because at some point I have to eat myself. And so there's that contradiction. And the disinterested aspect seems to also fall in that sort of the prejudice. At least my understanding is, if you're disinterested, you don't have any prejudice. But the other thing that I wanted to mention, we always kind of having examples of example looking at a house or looking at an object. But this, when we change this example to an activity, for example, i.e. eating the word, or let's say playing tennis, would that help us to kind of understand this reduction in a more fluid way? Because every time I practice it, as part of that growth, as part of that learning, so there is essentially a reduction is happening there, and I become better and better. And would that help us to exemplify this in a more tangible way?
I'm not sure. Let me tell you what I think. You could tell me more about what you might have in mind. It's not that you weren't clear. I followed you very well. Let me say this. The actions involved are perceiving and reflecting already. So the act of perceiving, right, when I'm reflecting on it, I'm above it, I'm not repeating it. It seems to mostly have to have gone by in order for me then to reflect. So there seems to be something about memory involved in reflection, but it's not simply memory, it's not simply repetition. It's a different orientation towards it, that we could see the structures of the transcendental ego by means of this straightforward perceiving. So it's already about actions. In ideas, Husserl, however, does say we can swim along after, for short stretches, the thing that we're actively doing. So we could, in fact, do phenomenological reflection on something that we are carried out straightforwardly. But he limits it. He says it's very hard to do, and you're really unable to do it for very long. If I am playing tennis and I do the epoche and I'm transcendentally reflecting on the way in which I'm doing tennis, I probably don't have the capacity to do tennis very well. Like I'm thinking about all the things that I'm doing and all the ways that my arms and hands are responding, and I'm thinking about what my body means, and then I get knocked in the face by the tennis ball coming from the other person, right? So it seems like I can't do phenomenology while I am engaged in this kind of activity, eating as well. Like I might suddenly realize what it is that I'm doing to myself is faulty, right? That I'm trying to eat the world, or whatever.
But let me
I
just pause you there. So I think
yeah,
that
go
the
ahead.
point interesting that you said, if I'm not doing that phenomenological, paying it all that attention, the ball will hit my face.
Yeah.
That's the point that I'm trying to say. So in fact, doing that is doing that reflection. You are so reflective on that moment that you're aware of all your surrounding, your position, the way you're holding the racket, and the way you hit it. Is in that reflection that you can do that.
Yes, though we would have to describe the kind of reflection that we're doing. And mostly the coach is going to say, watch the film, Peter. Watch what you were doing. You're going to see that your foot is here when it should be here, right? And so, yes, absolutely, if I understand you, I have to reflect on what I'm doing in order to get better at it. There's no doubt about that. But whether I do that phenomenologically or naturally, I'm not sure. All of this is to say, and I may have completely misunderstood you, and for that I apologize if that's true, but all that is to say this phenomenological reflection is radically different from the kind of reflection that I might try to do with our daughters about how to get better at a sport that they're playing. Because they're still taking the discussion as operating within the natural attitude. That is, this thing that you need to do is really out there, and it needs to be brought really in here into your own body. However, Merleau-Ponty does a similar kind of reflection when he says, look at what this means about the body. It means that the body grasps intelligently what it needs to do. And when it has grasped and understood it, the body can understand on its own, that is when it can do it. So Merleau-Ponty does take a kind of transcendental reflection on something like eating or playing tennis in order to say, look at the character of the lived body and look what that means about undoing the assumption of the distinction between mind and body. So it's what you say is proper and helpful. I just don't know how much phenomenological reflection can happen in the midst of straightforward action. Christos.
Thank you. I was just, so I'll make a couple of comments. I think so first of all, I really like the self-splitting. I think it seems a better wording. But I am interested in the as you mentioned, the above, sort of the uninterested or disinterested onlooker being above the naively interested ego. And I was just wondering about the importance of orientations and structure, and the usual tropes of power, of immortality, being up in the mountain of heaven and above, and earth below, and all these kind of things, and the echoes of, I was just thinking about in Greek, this is kind of translated, this kind of consciousness is apoptic consciousness coming from the Eleusinian mysteries, and how they would return they would have the experience and then they would return, to experience again, but with, of course, a different kind of consciousness, I guess, I don't know. So there's all these kind of interesting kind of echoes, but it kind of also positions the I'm not quite sure how it splits activity and passivity, but it certainly positions one as above with all its attendant kind of symbolic meanings. And so there was something kind of interesting in that. And then the other thing that I made dozens of, the other word that really struck me was page 36, intuitively. And this kind of, I think Olga was talking earlier about the intuition and the interpretation. And I think there's something really interesting about that. I was thinking along the kind of Sufi echoes, perhaps, how the holy or the sacred and the defiled are indistinguishable in certain kind of non-dual traditions, and that he puts the intuitive as purely intuitive, always kept free from all interpretations that read into them more than is generally seen. But in a sense, the intuitive goes beyond what is seen, really, always, because that's the whole point of intuition, that one is accessing realms and worlds and gateways through what is seen to something beyond that is not being seen. And I think that's the whole point of intuition, which seems to me a bit of a strange way of putting it, as if one is simply seeing surface, but the whole point is activating to experience depth through the surface. So that kind of seemed a bit strange to me. But anyway, again, just very interesting. I'll leave it at these two comments, but I'll keep reading. I've made dozens, particularly on the complementarity of them. Yeah, anyway, thank you.
Good. So what I can say, there's a lot that you've said, and I'm not sure that I'll be able to address everything. I will personally say that one of the things that St. Paul writes about is how people need to be aware of the second coming as not a point in time, but a change in the orientation, let's say, of the Christian, because, and one of the things that will happen, and one of the ways in which the Christian knows that they are on the right path, is when they can see through the Antichrist as not Christ, where everybody else who does not take up the parousia in a certain way will take the Antichrist for being Christ because they look so similar. They look exactly the same. And so the reflection of whether he's talking to the Thessalonians or Galatians, I can't remember, but it's in one of those where he basically says, this is why we can't take the meaning of the second coming to be this historical point on a line. And I'm only mentioning this, first of all, to try to resonate with the religious points that you said, probably of the Greek fathers and mothers in the wilderness, but also to say, the role of intuition is always partial, because intuition is only part of the act of intentionality, the act of meaning. We intend more than we intuit, but we only fulfill by means of intuition. So we are intending more than the surface when we run our fingers over the surface of the table. We feel, in a sense, its depth. We feel its fragility or its rootedness in the room. We see the strength of the house or the falling apartness of the house. Like, we don't just see the surface. We see by means of the surface towards the other sides or towards the depth. But that's because we intend more than we can have adequately in view intuitively. And this means that intuition is always including potential further fulfillment intuitions, right? So intuition is both full and empty, so to say. Christian.
Thank you. So I have some remarks. Firstly, maybe for better understanding the the idea of splitting oneself in a transcendental way, maybe Huygens think Sixth Cartesian Meditation would be a good read, because he speaks there actually about the status of being transcendental in reflection. The second remark, it's very interesting what Mohammad said and your dialogue, asking whether we could approach better the experience of reduction of epoche while playing something, for example. And I thought, now let's think about the scene. So we, Peter, are playing tennis, and it's quite fun. We are friends. The weather is excellent. Everything goes perfectly. We have some drinks, maybe, so on and so forth. And while playing, there comes a thought, maybe like, what am I doing here? This is perfect. This is sublime. This is, and I get perfectly aware about really everything, me, the world, the events, while playing, and still being concentrating on playing and not getting the the things in my face, as you said. So this, yes, you said, or you already highlighted the fact that the risk here is erroneously understanding this as a transcendental reduction or something in that area, because we are still in the natural realm. But still, while doing this bracketing, I'm not in the natural mood anymore, in no sense. So I'm in a split situation, so to speak. I won't say this is schizophrenia, because we are living this kind of reflections all the time. I intentionally chose a positive example, let alone speaking about envying you while playing, you are better than me, and then thinking, what the hell I'm doing here? You know, and that mood coming in that Heideggerian sense all over me, and realizing, what the heck am I doing? Why am I playing here? And even further, thinking, what's the point of all this? And so on and so forth. So this is really some existential reflection in the Heideggerian way. And the last remark, if I may, and it relates with what Christos said. There is a very interesting Christian concept, metanoia. It's a very important one for Christian experiencing. So again, a way maybe of understanding reduction and epoche.
That's very nice.
While praying, before doing that, of course, we can go right away and say, Father, our Father, or whatever, or the Jesus prayer, or so. But before that, we always have some kind of reflection. In the Christian life, the experience of oneself and the relation with the world and and others, you know, thinking about what you did in one day, or maybe you harm someone or whatever. This is all kind of reflections that put you in the sense of some kind of transcendental experience, because everything is in a bracken, you know, and and this is experience of full alterity of God. Even thinking him still personal, because you say you Father or you Jesus, you know. So this is for me something very, very interesting, in the sense that we actually maybe are experiencing some kind of transcendental reflection, or even we have access in the natural life, in the natural experiences of to this transcendental space, so to speak, without the kind of reflections that we see here by Husserl. And this is, I think, and I finish, the main point. Husserl discovers the transcendental realm because he has a specific horizon, having an absolute concept of science. But in my natural day experience, I don't need that. I don't need to know what's the absolute notion of science. Or for me, the absolute notion of science, for example, is that you, in a relationship, for example, you will say, I love you, or whatever. This is the pure knowing or science. So it's a more existential way of thinking. So I think we have different ways to enter the realm of transcendental experience. Thank you. And sorry if I was too...
No, I think personally, I find your reference, especially to Eugen Fink, to be very powerful. I think it is Fink in this sixth Cartesian meditation, which is intended to be a continuation of the book we're discussing now, where he says that, bye, Evan, where he says that the transcendental ego is prior to the distinction between one and many. That is, when we inhabit the transcendental ego, it is one, but it's not one in the sense of one among many, and it's not one in the sense of one prior to many. It is really prior to the entire distinction between self and other, or between one and many. So that's very interesting. The other thing that Fink says in that book, which I don't agree with, although Husserl said that everything that Fink said he agreed with completely, is that for Fink, there is no historical, personal route into transcendental phenomenology. That is, there is no psychological reason why people would take up the route of the epoche and the reduction. I think Husserl himself suggests in The Crisis that the fact that people are making atomic bombs using physics and chemistry is the reason to start looking at why human experience must be prepared and sustained by transcendental subjectivity. So I don't agree with him there, but I think the things you're talking about are really important. It may also be, to go back to Muhammad's point about the Sufi movement that he's seeing in Husserl, may also be, for example, if we were to really do religious experience, which I'm not very good at doing, at least in talking about Cartesian meditations, it may be that Islam and Judaism have worked out a way to attempt a bracketing by means of the prohibition against images with respect to God. That is, by saying God cannot be imaged, what we may be doing is bracketing the kind of ontological commitments that prevent us from seeing God or from communing with God. And so, in other words, I'm bringing up Christianity not to say this is what Husserl meant, even though he converted from Judaism to Christianity. I am saying, with respect to Christianity, your points, I think it's really an open question for Husserl how one can be motivated to take up this particular kind of reflection that is, for him, different from every other kind of reflection we could do. And so I'm just thinking about the prohibition against images as not just a prohibition like you need to follow our rule, but rather what does this allow us to describe and open up in terms of a relationship with God. Marvin.
Thank you. Really appreciate this theme of, I might call it the possibility of transcendental ego, or experience beyond the conventional subject-object in movement. And it's very interesting to hear that Husserl felt it was possible, but only very limited. And I can see that would be often the case, but I'm thinking of like the flow state in Csikszentmihalyi, that there may be phenomena, our experience of doing things may actually depend very much on our history. So the beginner at tennis doing a phenomenological reduction would get hit in the face, but over time, tens of thousands of hours of practice with the intention of returning the ball and all the awareness of the body position, that it seems possible that it might be possible to do a phenomenological reduction in the midst of it, which would agree with reports of people having these peak experiences, doing things that they're very expert at. But kind of philosophically, I'm still not convinced that they're transcending all intentionality, but perhaps they are giving up their intentionality to the force of habit of wanting to return the ball, and here's how I do it. And so in that sense, their conscious mind is not filled with the mundane need to, where's my hand? And oh, it's coming over there and whatever. It's all one flow experience. And so because it doesn't have that injection of the conscious manipulation of my body and where is it? And I'm over here and it's over there, that it's all, that in itself allows this transcendent experience. So I don't know if that's actually accurate to kind of equate this kind of transcendental experience with transcendental reduction, but perhaps, I don't know. I'd be interested in people's comments about that.
I want to thank you very much. I think that deserves a lot more time than I think we're able to give, because it's after 2, and at least I know I have to go. But I wanted to set us up for next time. So, Jeremy, are you willing to start us next time?
Yes.
Okay.
Definitely.
So we'll start with nothing from me. We'll go to Jeremy, and maybe you could put that in the chat next time as well, 2 weeks from today. And then we'll continue with Evan. And maybe we'll let Jeremy and Evan both go and both answer their own questions. And then I'll say some things about those sections if people want me to. And I'll end with the last 2 sections of the meditation. My guess is that will take up most of the time, but I'll prepare the first 2 sections of the 3rd meditation. And Olga, if you want to prepare the rest of it just in case, that would be fine, but probably aiming not next time, but the following time for you. Does anyone have any organizational things before I just have to go, before I go, or any comments or suggestions?
Can I digress for 5 seconds? Okay. I just want to make announcement to everybody that I am leading now an environmental battle for views of Mount Shasta, which is actually a globally visited location. And so there is a paradoxical situation when these views can be taken away by commercial solar farms. So if you want to give a hand to people who are fighting against the solar farms, which is not against solar farms per se, but against locating them on the slopes where everybody is hiking and enjoying the views. So please drop me an email. I'll send you a link to the petition. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Olga. Sorry you have to deal with that. Anyone else? Marvin, I'm sorry to not be able to respond to your question. I thank you all very much for coming. I look forward to next time. And thanks to Julia and to Sally for going first. All right. See you all.
Yeah, thank you.